Welcome back to the Kentucky Hot Wheels video collection. In this video, we're going to take this Hot Wheels Volkswagen Beetle and try to make it look as close to our 1968 Beetle as we can. Of course the years are different, so this will just be a representation of our Beetle. First things first. I'll take a 9/64 drill bit and drill out the flange of the pillars. Next, I'll let the body sit in some citrus paint stripper for a day or so. I'll throw the chrome-plated chassis in some bleach for about 10 minutes to remove the chrome. While the body is soaking in paint stripper, I'll go ahead and paint the interior a satin black. Then I'll do the same thing to the chassis. After only a few hours of soaking in the citrus paint stripper, it was ready to remove and clean. It usually takes a little longer in the stripper to remove the paint, but this time, it was pretty quick. This is just regular tap water that I use to clean most of the stripper off. With the body clean, I'll take a burr bit and remove the remainder of the pillar flange to prep it for drilling. With the pillar flange clean, I'll drill pilot holes in the pillars for the tap that I'll use to cut threads for the body screws. I'm using a 1/16 drill bit to drill the pilot holes. Be careful not to drill too deep or push too hard. I think it's time for a new drill bit. So far, so good. It's now time to degrease the body and give a good coat of primer. But first, I'm going to clean some of the flashing from the body with some fine sandpaper and a file. I'm using some good self-etching primer this time. I'll give it a couple of coats, then wet sand it before painting. The peaceful blue color is a very close match to the original Zenith blue of our Beetle. I'm very pleased with the results. Once the paint cures, I'll give it a couple coats of clear coat. A few years ago, I made a roof rack, surfboard, and swamp cooler for this Beetle that I made for my garage diorama. Now I get to recreate them again for this new custom. I'll use this spray nozzle from a can of WD-40 to create the swamp cooler. Remember, use what you have access to. I'll cut two pieces of the nozzle. One for the swamp cooler and one for the window attachment. The piece for the window attachment will be sanded until it's flat. Next, I'll superglue the two pieces together. For the exhaust pipes, I'll be using these wire terminals. I'll take a heat gun to heat them up, then remove the plastic caps. Now I'll start masking for the side stripes. This process can be a little trying. Just take your time and eventually, you'll achieve the results you want. You get the idea. It took me about 10 minutes to mask both sides. Next, I'll give the unmasked areas a couple coats of the ivory paint. After the paint cures for about 20 minutes, I'll remove the tape. It should end up looking something like this. I didn't want to just paint on the trim on the body, I wanted some physical trim to give it some depth. I thought about using pinstriping or water slide decals, but those really wouldn't add much depth. In the end, I decided to use this .38mm solder. It's difficult to work with, but I think it'll provide a nice look. Now I have to install it without screwing up the paint. I'm using some very thin, fast-setting super glue to secure the trim. Now I'll repeat the same process on the other side. This is a very tedious process. Lastly, I apply the trim to the hood. Like I mentioned earlier, this process was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. Overall, I'm very pleased with the end result. The passenger side didn't turn out as well as the driver side, but for a first attempt, it's perfectly good enough. Since my Beetle is lowered, I'll have to raise the axles a bit using this 1.57mm copper tubing. First, I'll need to prep the chassis by removing unnecessary plastic. And lastly, I'll do the same with the rear axle. This should raise the axles just enough to match the stance of our Beetle. I need to trim the chassis just a bit to accommodate the new axles. This burr bit will do the trick. And now, the other side. Off camera, I cut the axles from the wheels and tires and installed them into the new axles. Now I'll take my chrome pen and paint the bumpers and the headlights. My hands aren't as steady as they used to be, but I think everything turned out pretty good. A quick test fit to see how everything looks. Now it's time to install the swamp cooler. This is going to be another tedious step. I'll have to hold it just right before applying the super glue. This is what the back of the swamp cooler looks like. I'll use the head of a pin to replicate that look. I've already cut off the head of a pin. I left about a 1/8 inch lead to insert into the swamp cooler. I'm very happy with the end result, especially in such a small scale. Now it's time to marry the body to the chassis one last time. To simulate the front driving lights, I'll be using these small finishing nails. Again, at this scale, it's hard to find something that would be perfect, so I'll use what I have. Even 3D printing these would be difficult, but I'd at least give it a try if somebody wanted to send a 3D printer our way. I'll use a torch to heat up the nails, then use the heated nail to create a hole in the plastic. And now I'll do the rear. The nail head here will simulate my third brake light. I'll have to clean them up a bit and redo the chrome, but you get the idea. This isn't the roof rack and surfboard that I'll be using. As I mentioned earlier, I made this one for my VW diorama. I'll be making a new roof rack, surfboard, and cooler for this one. This just gives you some idea of where I'm headed. For the roof rack, I'll start with 2 pieces of a fine paper clip. Each will be 3/4 of an inch long in between the bends. Next, I'll solder a piece of 1/2 inch paper clip in between the 2 side pieces. We're just trying to get the basic shape. You should end up with something like this. Not perfect, but a good start. For the wooden slats on the roof rack, I'm using some wooden Q-tip stems. Just glue them together and cut to size. I'm also adding a little stain to give them some color. For the cooler, I'm using a piece of a surface mount relay that had gone bad. I just sanded it to size and gave it a spritz of chrome paint. For the surfboard, I'm going to start with this broken popsicle stick. I'll use the bench grinder to give it its basic shape. Just be sure to take your time and apply just a little pressure. Next, I'll refine it a bit better with some 1200 grit sandpaper. Since this is wood, I don't want to use anything too coarse. Before I go any further, I double check the dimensions to ensure it's to scale. I'll cut a small piece of cardstock to represent a fin and superglue it to the board. After the glue cures, I'll give everything a light coat of ivory primer, which will also represent the main color of the surfboard. Lastly, the top of the board and the edges will get a light coat of blue. Once the paint cures, it's time for one last test fit. I'll touch up the bumpers and paint the auxiliary lights one last time with some chrome paint. And now some red enamel paint to represent taillights. My hand isn't as steady as it used to be, but I'll do my best. And now some orange enamel paint to represent turn signals. And now some yellow enamel paint to represent the fog lights. While the paint is curing, I'll start on the display base. This one is going to be pretty simple. It'll represent my Beetle sitting in my gravel driveway. I'll start by using painter's tape to secure the base to my working glass. Next, I'll apply a generous layer of white school blue and then apply a liberal amount of sand. I'll follow up with a spritz of isopropyl alcohol, then saturate with my mixture of 1 part white glue, 3 parts water. Sit it aside for about 30 minutes, then remove the tape. When the tape is removed, it should look something like this. Now I'll sit it aside for 24 hours before doing anything else. With most of the display base complete, I'll finish the body by attaching the exhaust pipes. When the glue is cured on the display base, I'll secure it one more time to my working glass to give it a couple coats of flat gray, then come back later with a light spritz of flat black. This should be a pretty good representation of our gravel driveway. After the paint on the base cures, I think it's time to call this one finished. When you're working at this scale, it's hard to determine how much detail is enough, whereas a 1/43 scale would be much easier to add all of the little details. Like I mentioned in the community post, this was a viewer challenge and I believe the end result is pretty good. I may try this challenge again in the future and use a 1/43 scale diecast to start with. Anyhow, I really hope that you enjoyed this little project and maybe found some useful tips. If so, please take a second to give the video a like and share, and please consider subscribing to our channel. Now, this latest custom can join the others. Until next time, take care.